Can you tell us about what war you served in, branch of service?
I was in the infantry in Vietnam. Actually, I was drafted, and after going through basic training, advanced infantry training, people said, you got a college degree, you should really be an officer. And I said, I'm an officer. So I did go to officer candidate school at Fort Benning. It meant an extra year, but I thought I should be an officer.
So did you get drafted right out of college, or
no?
Had you gotten a deferment, or how did that?
When I graduated college, I was single, and at that time it was like 1965. They were looking for so many people. They were drafting at a high volume, and I kind of knew. I was in good health, single, whatever, and sure enough, 5 months after I graduated college, I got my draft notice.
Interesting. All right. So then you went to OCS, Fort Benning, you said that?
Fort Benning. And after that, I became a basic training officer, training recruits in Fort Campbell, Kentucky. And from there, I was there about a year, and then I got orders to go to Vietnam.
So, and you'd already been in how long at this point? This is already...
Well, it's about a year, year and a half.
And you were prepared, you assumed that's what you were going to, that you were going to be heading to Vietnam at that point?
Yeah, at that point, especially coming out of officer candidate school in the infantry, because they were losing a lot of lieutenants, infantry platoon leaders, so I kind of knew that I would probably go.
And you were a lieutenant at that point?
Yeah, I was lieutenant, second lieutenant.
And so it sounds like, so if you grew up in New York City and then Connecticut, was it a shock going south to, when you tell us a little bit about when you first did basic training? You'd been a college guy, you'd gone to UConn. What was that like?
Well, the one thing I always remember is here I was a college guy, and I was on a bus with some kids who never got out of high school, and we all had our look to us, either if it was a kind of a tough look or a scholarly look or whatever, and then you got to basic training, and all of a sudden your hair was shaved off, and you all had the same uniform, and everyone was equal. And I always thought that was one thing that's very positive about the military. You had to prove yourself, and it wasn't about your look or whatever.
Or where you came from.
Or where you came from, exactly.
So I would think that would have been, one of the, and certainly lots of vets talk about how formative that is to be with folks with very different backgrounds, different parts of the country, different families.
Yes, and you had to pay your dues, that kind of thing. I was lucky. I had one gentleman who I went to the University of Connecticut, and he was in basic training with me. So we became good friends through basic training. And then we had orders to go to Fort Jackson for advanced infantry training, and he and I both went there too.
And so what did you do as part of that advanced infantry training at that point? You're getting ready for skill sets you're going to need to use in country in Vietnam, presumably, right?
Well, at that time, I didn't have my orders, but I kind of, in the back of my mind, I thought somewhere down the line I was going to have to go to Vietnam, being in the infantry. So we went through advanced infantry training, then I got my commission, and I went to Fort Jackson, and then I still knew it was coming, and then the orders did come.
So when was that at that point that you went over to Vietnam?
Well, that was in, I'm trying to think now, 1967. I think it was in something like April 67.
Now, had you ever been out of the country before?
No. That was my all-expenses trip to Asia. No, I never had. And it was interesting. I guess I had...
Had you been on an airplane before? I think it's hard sometimes, and I think students listening to this who've gotten really used to travel by different ways, that dialing back the clock to 1960, it's not like everybody got on planes all the time.
Right. No, just only flying when I was in the service to the different bases.
So the first times you flew were once you were in the military?
Yeah. And before going to Vietnam, I got my orders, and the Army made a mistake. They sent 90 officers to Fort Lewis, which was Washington, which was kind of the holding area, but the orders for all the non-enlisted or non-commissioned
Right.
soldiers, their orders was to go to Fort Lewis like 60 days later. So here the Army had 90 officers in Fort Lewis
With no troops.
and no troops, because we went over on a troop ship. So that's why it was so many, and they didn't know what to do with the 90 officers.
So what did they have you do then?
They attached me to an engineer battalion, and I went to, at that time, the engineers went and built the Boy Scout Jamboree each year. So I went to Coeur d'Alene with them. I didn't know a thing about putting a nail in wood.
Did they teach you?
No, they just gave me a Jeep and they said, get lost because you're just going to mess things up. But then finally the troops came and we all went over on a troop ship.
So that would have then been, was it summer then? I'm trying to think.
It was, yes. I think it was summer. But of course on the Pacific it was beautiful.
Yeah, how long did it take you to go across?
I think it was about, I'm trying to think back, about a week.
Now, did you have training? How much did you do drilling or training with the troops in Washington before you went over? I mean, you were coming from different parts of the country, so...
Didn't have any training.
Wow.
Didn't have it. And that's one thing that...
Now, was that typical, or was that, at that time, typical?
Yes, I honestly don't feel that people who went to Vietnam were trained or knew quite what was going to go on there. There was so much that you had to know, and it was on-the-job training. Mm-hmm. And when I got to Vietnam, I relied a lot on my platoon sergeant and the guys in my platoon to bring me up to speed, because we really weren't trained. There were so many people being sent, and they just didn't have the time to train for jungle warfare.
Right. Right, which we didn't have a lot of prior experience in.
We didn't have a lot of prior experience, yeah. So you kind of learned on the job.
So you arrived. Where did you land, and sort of once you got to Vietnam, sort of where were you assigned? Where did your
the boat came in at, I believe it was not Tan Son Nhut, I forget the name exactly where it was, and then I was part of the 1st Infantry Division, and I went up to Phuoc Vinh was mm-hmm. the first base I worked out of. Mm-hmm. It was all in what they called 3 Corps, which was from Saigon up to Lai Khe and up to the Cambodian border, and those are all the operations I was in that area.
Mm-hmm. And remind us again what year we're now, 1960?
It was 1967, probably June, July 67. Mm-hmm. And then I was there until I guess it was January 68, when the first Tet Offensive, which was quite a shock to the United States that the enemy, who we said we were winning the war, all of a sudden attacked us. And even though militarily they didn't gain much, it was just the impression, I think, that was sent back to people in the United States saying, wait a minute, we may not be winning this war.
If you dial back to yourself at that time, let's think, you were in 43, so you're like 24 years old, 25 years old. Was it shocking to you? What was it like? Actually, let's back up. What was it like every day? Like, you get up. What were you doing? What were your tasks?
And that's one thing I think that a lot of people don't understand. There was not warfare every day,
right?
And you could go for weeks and months, even on end, without ever getting hit or ambushed or whatever. So what we would do is we would go out on an operation, search and destroy. So they'd come out and they'd take the whole company by 5 helicopters as 4 helicopters, 1 platoon, and then 4 more and 4 more, and then just drop us into an area where I guess they thought that there were Viet Cong or North Vietnamese. And when we set up a base camp, and we would go during the day on what they call search and destroy missions, trying to find the enemy and where the enemy was. And at night, we'd go out, some in the platoon would go out on what they call an ambush patrol, where you go way out and then you just set up and hope that the enemy would come by, and then you would open up and get the heck back.
And were you in active ambushes? And did you take rotations for, say, those night duty? Is that something that you as a lieutenant would go out with a group and you rotate with other lieutenants?
Right. Well, I went out with my platoon on one ambush patrol one night. Another lieutenant with his platoon would go out another night, and there was 4 lieutenants in the company. So we would alternate. I was very lucky as I look back. I mean, I was rocketed, I was mortared and whatever, but I thank God never got all out ambushed. Sadly, I was brought, after 6 months, I was brought back to base camp to be the executive officer. 2 weeks later, my platoon was ambushed, and they lost like three soldiers, and that could have been me. It's just luck. I mean, it's really you never know. You know. So in that regard, I guess I was lucky.
Yeah. But you have to be vigilant all the time. I mean, Nothing may happen, but you don't know whether anything.
Never know. It was the intensity of never knowing, and you could almost be lulled in operation after operation, day, night, but nothing happened. But it's that one time, and all hell could break loose.
Exactly. So, would you interact very much with the villagers in the area out in rice paddies? I mean, what was that like? It must have been so strange coming from the East Coast, coming from Connecticut, and to be dropped in this humid jungle and rice paddies and stuff you'd seen on TV, but you're actually in it.
I always felt for the Vietnamese who were not part of the enemy, not part of they were just farmers. They were just there caught up in a war. And it was very sad, because you would see these mothers with their little children and whatever, and they'd see, you know, the tanks would go by and whatever, and they just didn't, I guess they understood, but they, you know, why me? Why are you in this country doing this? And why is the North Vietnamese fighting with you? Yeah, and they're just farmers. We called mama-sans, ladies who sometimes would, I don't know where they got it, but they'd get some Coca-Cola bottles. And if you were out on patrol or whatever, you could actually, and you were on a road where these mama-sans were, you'd buy a bottle of Coke. I mean, it was really kind of bizarre in that regard. You know, you're in a war zone, but yet the villagers are selling you Coca-Cola. What struck you? I mean, this was a war that was on TV every day, which you certainly saw as a college student, and then when you were preparing to go over. What struck you once you were there about, like, oh, this is not what I expected, or this is so different than it looks like on TV? Were there things, can you remember back when you first got there, that might have struck you about whether it was very different than what the TV image was or what you expected it to be? I didn't think that much about what was going on back home. I found out when I came home, the anger against the war and whatever. Which had changed a lot then. Which had changed a lot, right, especially after Tet. Right. But you were just worried about your men. And they were worried about you, and you were worried about getting through day to day to day. That's your focus. And so there was nothing political at that time, other than Tet, when all of a sudden, what's going on here? Why are they attacking us if we're winning the war? Right. Well, we'll talk about that. You mentioned how transformative that was of sort of U.S. public opinion. We were talking history before about how that really startled, shocked the U.S. that how could we be this great superpower and how this happened. How did it feel to you in country? What did you and the guys you were with, what did you talk about? How did that work out? How did you experience that? Was that something you saw yourself, or you only heard through channels? Or we heard more that it was a very coordinated, synchronized attack throughout the country on a certain day. All I knew at the time was I had come in as an executive officer in the base camp, and ironically it was in the with a former Michelin rubber plantation, and that's our base. And
maybe pretty nice digs then.
Yeah, well, a lot of nice rubber trees, but we built an airstrip in the middle. So I was back in base camp. And I had never been rocketed. A mortar is one thing. A rocket, you could hear the things going through the trees and they explode. And that was kind of scary because rockets do quite a lot of damage. Matter of fact, I think I have a photo of a rocket that hit a helicopter and it's just ashes. So after that, we found out they just weren't attacking where I was. This happened throughout the country.
And how did you learn that? I mean, what kind of communication did you get when, might have been probably different when you were executive officer than when you were out in the field? Were you getting radio, you know, were you able to listen to radio? How did you hear about what was going on?
In base camp, you could get radio, Free America or whatever, I forget the exact name, so you could get that. And we kind of heard that way. But again, we were more focused on day-to-day. We couldn't take care of that. We just didn't know about the politics. We just wanted to go day-to-day.
So how about a typical day in which you didn't know whether anything was going to happen, but you're in base camp, you get up, what time would you get up? What would you have to eat? Did you eat in like a big mess hall? Was it a small group? So try to describe what it was like, and what were the ages of the folks you were serving with, senior people and the junior people? Give us a picture of who these folks were.
Wherever you were in country, unless you were guessing Ho Chi Minh City, but you always had a perimeter. So there was always people up all night long because you never knew when there was going to be an attack, whatever. So if it wasn't you were sleeping, but somebody was all around that perimeter, and you would have trip flares and you would have claymore mines and whatever. Then people who were on that, or an ambush patrol that was out, they would come in and they'd kind of sleep during the day, and then you'd have another platoon that would go out for a daylight search and destroy. It always amazed me, and I have great pride in the American soldier, because here I was 23, 24 years old, but I had guys in my platoon who were 17, 18 years old, and I'll never forget going out. For an ambush patrol, we go out just as the sun was setting, 7 o'clock at night, whatever. So you'd go way out, and then you would set up. And what we would do is we would bring in concentrations of mortar rounds all around you, so that in the middle of the night, if you saw any movement, you would know what concentration you would bring in. Because the one thing with an ambush patrol, I don't want to get too militaristic here, but the one thing is you never wanted to blow the ambush patrol and open up, unless you knew you had, you were really going to do a lot of damage. Because once you did that,
they knew where you were.
They knew where you were. So you had to then come back in at night, which was very scary. So if you saw some movement, you could bring a mortar round in, and no one would know where that came from.
And protect the integrity of safety of
the patrol. But I'll never forget the one time out, I had what we call a forward observer. And these are a soldier who is very good. I mean, their hearing was fabulous in terms of they knew by the blast exactly how far it's out. And the first time I went out, this soldier told me, the forward observer said, "Okay, Lieutenant Smith, I'm going to bring the first concentration." And so he threw it out like 200 yards. And he says, "I'm going to drop at 50. I said, "Fine." And he dropped at 50, and he dropped at 50. And pretty soon you could hear the shrapnel coming closer over your head. And he says, "Do you want to drop at another 50? And I said, "I don't think so." And all I could think about here is that he was 17 years old. And my life depended on a 17-year-old. I don't know what his background is, whatever, but he was so good at doing that. I mean, these are who you relied on, and it impressed me. I just a lot of respect for the American soldier.
Now, we had talked a little bit beforehand about just during the Tet Offensive, a lot of American soldiers were killed. And you were a lieutenant. That was a vulnerable position. You were in a part of the country where things were hot at points. When did you first know someone who was killed, and describe a little bit what that was like, because that's just not something you can prepare for really ahead of time, I wouldn't think.
I was in base camp, and I remember going to the supply sergeant, and he brought in all this equipment from those who were killed in my platoon, which I no longer was platoon leader, and I remember bringing the helmets and everything, and it's kind of devastating, but you got to keep going on. I know I had become good friends when I was in Fort Lewis, Washington, with a lieutenant who I got to know really well during the 60, 90 days I was there. And then he went off to another company, another division. And just before I went off on my R&R, I had called back for something to the base camp and found out that he was killed with a mortar round. And that was devastating to me, because when we were friends in Fort Lewis, his wife came out to visit him, so I got to know his wife, and it was a mortar round that came out of nowhere kind of thing.
It could happen to anyone.
Could happen to anyone, yeah.
What was the stress of that like, with like utter boredom, heat, boredom, bugs, sound, day after day, and then never knowing? How did you manage that sort of personally, and how did you manage for the troops? They're looking to you to lead them, and people need to be vigilant, but you can't. How do you maintain that level of vigilance and not kind of a crazy?
I think it was again, this is the American soldier, why I have such great pride in wherever they are in a conflict or war. They all look after each other. They all know what's on the line. They all will give their life for you. So I didn't have to motivate them a lot. I just had to make sure everything was right when we were going to go out, and that they knew what the orders were. And they all knew what they had to do. So their morale was good. I mean, it was all for one and one for all kind of a thing. And I didn't have to do a lot of motivating.
When you first got there, you said there was not a lot of training for the troops or for you, so you had to rely. Talk a little bit about the people who mentored you, who you learned from when you got there. Who were these people? Where were they from? What was your first impression of them? And then, as you got to know them, sort of what did they impart to you? What did you take away from your experience?
And this is the training part.
And feel free to name names. These are all people. These are Americans who served, not all of whom came home, who answered that call that they were required to answer or chose to answer.
My radio operator, Jake, love to reunite with him. African-American gentleman, young 17-year-old. First time we went on an ambush patrol, we were all set up, and you each had a couple hours on watch, so there was somebody always up. And then when I was up, I had just lit up a cigarette. I had cupped it so that you couldn't see the light or whatever. And I'll never forget, now here I'm a lieutenant, and I hear this, "Put it out, Lieutenant Smith." I said, "What do you?" And I'm thinking, here's a private smacking me, whatever. And he says, "No, they can smell that, and you wouldn't believe what the Viet Cong can sense and whatever." So I put it out. So that was on-the-job training. I didn't know. I remember the first time we had some movement, they call, in the middle of the night. And we used to put out listening posts. You'd send out 2 people, put out trip flares and claymores, so that if anybody was coming towards the perimeter, they would see it before they ever got to the perimeter. And I remember there was a lot of movement, and you can't talk because obviously here. So
would you signal, or what would you do?
Well, it's interesting because I was with my platoon sergeant, and the platoon sergeant would talk and say, how many do you think there are? If you think it's 5 to 10 or something, break squelch on the radio once. If you think it's more, break squelch twice. And I realized that he was actually talking to them and they were talking to him just by the, and giving instructions or whatever. We were never taught that in the States. So I quickly became up to speed on all these little things that you learned on the job. And I relied on the men I was with to teach me so much. And hopefully I taught them when we had new people come into the platoon.
Right. And how often would you have people coming in or out? I mean, how long would you, how much did they keep the integrity of your platoon, or was that dependent on?
Not that often. It was basically knew you were going to be in Vietnam for a year. So when the year was up, you'd go out and they'd bring somebody in.
And
they're just rotating.
Now you talked about having R&R. Where did you go for R&R, and how far into your tour, in-country tour, was that?
That was about 7 months in, and I went to Bangkok. And went on a floating village and saw the kickboxing and whatever. It was basically to get your mind off of where you were coming from.
Did it work to do that?
It did, but it's, you wanted to go back to, it's strange. I mean, you would think you were away, but your men were there. And there was tremendous camaraderie, and you wanted to be where they were, as opposed to, I mean, you enjoyed R&R, but it was, another situation was when I was in, about 6 months in, I developed an infection on my arm, so they lanced my arm and they taped it up. But it was called cellulitis. It never got better. It got worse and worse. And I said, I'm fine. And one of the lieutenants says, you're not fine. You have to have an operation or something. So they medevaced me to Cam Ranh Bay. And they did surgery on my arm, and they said, you're going to be here for 30 days. But and Cam Ranh Bay was beautiful. I mean, the beaches, I'd go down to the beach and I'd say, you know, I could see someday a Hilton. Which today there probably is a Hilton. And I got to see Bob Hope, which I respect that man forever. But strange as it seems, I couldn't wait to go back to the troops. And I said, here I am, the beach, the thing, and whatever, which you knew the people who were there, and you just wanted to be there to help and do your part. It sounds crazy, but that's the camaraderie you had.
Has there been anything in your life that has equaled that kind of level of camaraderie?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm very close with fraternity brothers in college, but I guess when you go through a life and death everyday situation, that bond is with you forever. I mean, I can walk into a group with a Vietnam vets I get together periodically, and it's like that the minute you're with them. Yeah, it's strange. It's just a feeling. It's a great binder of relationships. It bonds it together.
You had mentioned before a shocking incident that in some ways with the death of someone you were close to, and could you share that story, because I think it's powerful about your relationship with the people you served with, but also how things go awry. I mean, it's war, things happen, and with all the best of intentions, sometimes things happen. Could you share a little bit about that story?
Yeah, I had my infantry platoon. I was platoon leader, and then I had come into, as I think I mentioned, to executive officer, and then I was 2 weeks after I was executive officer, my platoon was ambushed, and some men were killed. And I remember this one young soldier, Gary Gable. And I just always liked Gary a lot, and I thought I would write his parents and just tell them, because we're, you know, a world apart, and they want to know so much. Parents want to know if you were killed, what happened, what it was exactly happened. Sounds weird and morbid, but they want, I've seen this many times, they want to know exactly what went on. So I thought because I was there with him, that I would write them a letter. And I was always told in Vietnam, if you were killed, probably within 48 hours or within 3 days, your parents would be notified, and somebody would come with a chaplain and somebody, a major or general from the ROTC unit there. So I waited 7 days, and I sent a letter, figured it would take another couple of days, and that would be 10 days, and they were notified, but I would, at least the letter would make them feel a little bit better. Amazingly, sadly, and I was horrified when I heard, the letter got there, and that's how they were notified before the chaplain ever got there. And I was told grave registrations in Saigon was so backed up that some people wouldn't be notified that their son was killed for 7, 8, 9, 10 days.
And this was during right after the Tet.
Right after the Tet Offensive. So I was called to the tent of the company commander, and he said, Lieutenant Smith, there's a congressional investigation against you. And of course I thought it was a joke, but then he told me the story. Well, make a long story a little bit short, turns out that the congressional investigation went to the parents. The parents says, whatever you do, don't hold any charges against Lieutenant Smith. Matter of fact, his letter, we felt so good about it, and it made us feel so good, we framed it and put it over his coffin at his funeral. And so when I got home from Vietnam, I went to the Vietnam Memorial, and there you can find out exactly when somebody died and where their hometown is just by looking up. So I looked up Gary Gable, found out his hometown, went to the newspaper to find out what his address was, because they have it in the newspaper, the obituaries and whatever. And that's how I found out his address, and then I got the phone number and I called his parents. And I said...
So was this 1968 now?
This was in, yes, 1968. I guess it was like the summer of 68. And I told them, I said, if they'd like, since I thanked them what they did with the letter and whatever, no charges, I would fly out to see them. And they said, oh, please, we would love to see you and talk with you. So I flew out, and I didn't know driving out to the house in Ohio what the reception would be. And when I pulled up, they had this huge American flag draped in front of the house, and they had the family and the relatives and the aunts, uncle, all there waiting for me. And the reception was amazing. It was amazing. And I guess I felt they should be bitter that their son was killed in an unpopular war. But they were so proud of America, the Army, and his service. They had that sense of pride. They showed me his pictures and when he was a little boy and how he'd go fishing and whatever. And I thought to myself, I hope America never loses this, because this is what America, that kind of a, what should I say, faith, backbone, something is just tremendous when they could have been bitter people.
Well, that was in stark contrast to much of the reception that you and the men you served with received for, Summer of Love, 1968, coming back, growing resentment, concern about the war, questions about it.
Yeah. In retrospect, it was a very unpopular war, and maybe we should have pulled out a lot sooner, because we probably knew we could have a stalemate forever, we could still be there, but we knew we're not going to win a war, because a guerrilla war is very tough to win, because the guerrillas never go away, and we saw that from the American Revolution. We were the guerrillas.
It's their land. It's their land.
That's right. And at night they appear, and at day they're farmers. And I think we should have got that message a lot sooner. And I think more and more people kind of said, we're not going to win this war. And then the announcer, the most trusted person,
Walter
Cronkite, yeah, when he turned against it. And after Tet, I think at that point, the message got out, and then the protests really kind of
How
heated up.
did you feel yourself coming back? It must have been relieved to be back, but then worried about the guys who were still out there and knowing what they were enduring.
It was. Matter of fact, my platoon sergeant was from Brooklyn, and I told him, he said, could you, Lieutenant Smith, you're from New York, could you go see my mother and tell her I'm okay? I said, I will go see your mother. Of course, I couldn't find his house in Brooklyn, but it's typical. Somebody said, Sergeant Marino's, I gave the address, so he says, yeah, his mother lives up there. And so, in this typical, I mean, you could put this on television show. This guy yells up, he says, Maria, Lieutenant Smith's here. And Maria looks down, I said, oh, come on. I said, no, this is like, I wouldn't believe this, but that's Brooklyn. Everyone knew it. Everyone knew everyone and whatever. So I did go see the parents. But it was, you still thought about the people there because you were so happy to leave. In the Freedom Bird, they call the jet. Once you get it, yeah.
So you came back by jet then?
I came back by jet.
And I know there's been some discussion and thinking about, and particularly Adam, you came back from Kabul last summer, how some have speculated now whether the experience of going over by ship and coming back allowed a transition, and how sort of Vietnam was really the first war, and now that continues on to the present day, where people came back by plane. So you were in country, you were in the heat of warfare, and then within 24, 48 hours, you would be back on American soil. Can you talk about that? Since you had the experience of going over by boat and having that time with other troops, etc., if that struck you, or if you have any thoughts on that?
I think at that point for me,
or you just wanted to get home.
I wanted to get home. I just wanted to get home, and I was so happy to be in the air. And when I came into McGuire Air Force Base, just around Fort Dix. So then I lived in New York City. My parents lived in New York City, so I just wanted to get home. But quickly I learned you don't want to wear a uniform around because it was such. Maybe hatred, or they just despise the warriors, the troops. So you wouldn't want to go walking around with your uniform. People looked at you like a little bit of disdain.
That must have been hard.
It was, but I guess and that mixed with the joy of being back in America.
Now, did you stay in touch, or do you still stay in touch with any of the folks that you served with?
Two of them we stay in touch with. One I went over with, and one I got to know over there. I do, yeah. But I do have I go to a veterans group, a Vietnam veterans group, which was started by a gentleman, a B-52 pilot, who has a distinction of, he was the last B-52 shot down in Vietnam. But thank God the whole crew bailed out over the South China Sea, and they got them all. Wow. So the helicopters got them all. But he started something with businessmen and others in the New York City area, and he just grew and grew and grew. And now he has probably 50 people on his mailing list, and he gets together, everyone who can make it, every 3 months, and we get together for lunch and drinks. And it's wonderful because, again, the camaraderie, and they served in different times in the Marines and the Air Force and the Navy. But it's just very close-knit. It's good being with, and it's very positive. It's not no war stories in a negative way.
Well, I know you've been, a real champion for vets in our area, and help provide that support. What do you think we could be doing differently or better to help support our veterans in thinking about the challenges people face when they come back?
Well, one, for those who have PTSD, get them the psychiatric care they need as quick as possible. And I don't know if that's quite happening as fast as needed. I keep hearing that veterans who do come back with these kinds of mental challenges, they're medicated tremendously. just the answer is more medication, more medication. And I guess in some ways we don't know exactly how to treat PTSD. We can't get rid of it overnight, but they're very, very, very much medicated. There's a movie out, I guess it was To Hell and Back Again or something like that. I forget the exact title. And it follows somebody who's come back and his wife and how medicated he is and how the challenges he has from day to day. So the psychiatric, number one. Two, help the vets get a job and get into the employment arena, into the private sector. It's a big change going from the military to the private sector. And
well, you came back, you were an officer, so what happened to you personally? You came back, you were not to wear your uniform, you were a college guy, you'd been an officer there, you came back to New York City, so what did you do, sort of employment-wise? How did you take those skills, or did you feel like you took those skills from your time?
Well, what I relied on was my college degree, because saying you were in the military, you didn't want to kind of say that. Yeah, it was on your resume, but that's not something you would try to leverage to get a job. My last 4 months in the military was in the Boston Army base. I was OCS recruiting officer, going to different colleges, talking about OCS.
What was that like?
It was interesting. It was interesting.
Recruit in Boston.
Well, I went to Assumption College and I had a sit-down demonstration day one, the first college I went to.
Did that surprise you? I mean,
it did.
Because you had only recently been back. How long had you been back before?
Well, I'd only been back like probably a month. And then it did surprise me, but then I knew the war was not popular. But I did that for 4 months, and then I got out, and I was in Boston, and at the time, the job market was pretty good. So I started to put my resume out, and again, the college degree helped a lot.
What was your degree in?
It was in economics, and so I went to work for Shell Oil. But the other part is the psychiatric care and the jobs. I think if we can get vets into jobs quicker and make the connect. There's a lot of sites now where a veteran can go in and look at their MOS, what they did in the service, and relate it to what discipline or industry would be best for them. But it has to be all it's scattered all over the place. So a veteran sees all these resources and probably sees none. I understand Michelle Obama launched a site now that tries to do that.
Yeah, they're trying to have a one coordinated site, I think, in part to deal with this issue of, you can be overwhelmed by too much, too many different resources, and trying to have one-stop shopping.
That's right. And they get frustrated in trying to find where to go to get it. I think would be wonderful, I don't know how we would do this, but if we could somehow allow vets to connect with other veterans who are working in companies to network with. Because I think most veterans, if they got a call that it was another vet just asking for advice, like you're in the media industry and I think I want to get in the media industry, or you're in human resources, can you help me out and tell me what I need to know and how I should go about it? I think the connect would be there. The bond is there. It's just getting that database of all the vets throughout America.
You could serve as mentors and answer questions.
That's it. Advice. Advice is critical.
Right. How do you think serving as you did and the time you did, how do you think it changed you?
Surprisingly, I think I'm going to say surprisingly, it made me proud of this country. And I will never forget when I got home, I was in New York, and a couple of weeks after I went to a Yankee game. And when they played the Star-Spangled Banner, and I know it sounds kind of corny and whatever, but I never stood up prouder than that moment. I mean, to me, the Star-Spangled Banner, I would get through this music, I'm standing up, what's going on, whatever. But I was there knowing the great guys, the camaraderie, the teamwork of the military in a very difficult war, how well and how proudly they served. And they were still there doing that, and I made it home, and I just felt great to be an American, to know that I was part of that in this country, despite the protests and whatever. So I think it's a great pride. It instilled a pride for me in America.
And that's clearly lasted.
Yeah, I still think the best country in the world,
no,
despite of all our issues.
No, I agree with you on that. But during that time, which was not a time that certainly college campuses were full of proud patriots, shall we say? It was not kind of the sentiment at that point. Would you advise someone to go into the military now, knowing what you've been through? Obviously, it's a different time. We have a volunteer force, not a draft or sort of a declared war situation.
I would, in this respect. I think the military, like maybe in Israel, everyone should serve a year in the military. And the reason I say that, you learn, I think, so much discipline. You learn, like I said, when I was in basic training, within 24 hours, you were all the same. No one got any benefits or favors for them. You all had to work your way up. Diversity in the Army was incredibly good. Same uniform, same whatever. So in terms of discipline and working with other people and seeing the world, if you make a career of it, leadership, teamwork, all of those things, the military is excellent, I think, for that. The only thing is, in a time of conflict, some of the number of redeployments I'm hearing that some of these soldiers and National Guard do is I don't know. It scares me. I went to Vietnam knowing after a year I was out, I was gone, I was never going back. Right. Today I hear some going over for 3 or 4, 5 deployments.